This next piece is an excerpt from a short story I wrote last year. It appeared in an anthology called Glitter and Mayhem, which is an anthology themed around parties, roller derby, sex, debauchery, all sorts of things like that. I decided to set my story, which is called A Hollow Play, in a cabaret because I experienced a cabaret show for the first time last year in Glasgow in the Rio Cafe and decided that it absolutely needed to be in a story as well. The wine was good, the conversation easy. Emily felt herself relaxing, becoming aware of how little effort she was making, how unnecessary it felt to play at being wry and unaffected and vaguely disdainful of anything she passionately loved. By the time the lights dimmed and a tall man in red spats and cerulean trousers announced the beginning of the show, she was feeling excited. The first act was a startling realization of Emily's earlier expectations, as a short, bearded man unfolded a keyboard, flicked his coattails behind him, and sat down to play something melancholically sinister, while a young woman in layers of fringed and shimmering fabric, loops of large white beads, and a flapper's red headscarf expertly drew a violin bow along the edge of a saw. The result was equal parts mournful and uncanny.
That was amazing. Is it all like this?
Not quite.
The next act saw Emily covering her face while an attractive young man hammered nails up his nose.
Come on, it's not that bad. It's mostly tricks anyway.
Anna, he's bleeding. He stuck a needle in his arm and it drew blood.
He's a professional.
His hands are shaking. This isn't right.
It's just part of the whole blockhead routine, honest. I've watched him do it loads of times.
Really?
She dared a peek between her fingers, winced, and covered her eyes again.
Really? Well, not the needle. I think that's new. But the nails are standard. Come on, you can't miss this. He's going to swallow those razors and knot them together in his throat.
I think I need the loo. And we should have more drinks. Same again?
Sure. Coward.
Emily stuck her tongue out and beat a hasty retreat. It was equal parts the half-light, the show, and the wine, but the Rio had clearly slipped somewhere just slant of real. Navigating the distance between table and toilets felt like lucid dreaming. She passed men with moon-white faces and bowler hats. She washed her hands next to a woman in scarlet lingerie with mouse ears and a cheese-grater crotch. It felt like a secret carnival, like a place a runaway could call home. She sat down again just as the blockhead was taking a bow, thankfully none the worse for wear. Anna looked positively fond as Emily pushed a new glass of wine toward her.
You've got the look
The look?
of the hooked, the enchanted. You're one of us now.
Just like that? By running away from the blockhead?
It takes all sorts. I can't wait for you to see Lynette. She's usually on towards the end. She's something else. I could go on about her and not be able to say how.
Once the applause died down, the MC stepped forward to announce the final act and encouraged everyone to stay precisely where they were. Then the lights went out. The cafe buzzed for a minute until a spotlight clicked on, shining up from the floor, illuminating a woman seated on a tall stool. But not completely. Shadows striped her face and body, and as Emily took the scene in, she saw that the spotlight was shining through an ornate birdcage, projecting its bars against the wall and woman together. When Anna said Lynette would be dressed as a bird, Emily had imagined something a bit camp, a bit silly, maybe a bit sexy into the bargain. She hadn't expected this tall, solemn, slender creature of angles and air, delicate golden brown feathers sprouting from the shoulders, hips, and hem of a long white dress worn over slightly incongruous brown boots. Thick, dark curls were piled on top of her head, against which leaned a high, feathered fascinator. There was an air of honey and copper about her, a shimmering sweetness. Emily's breath caught at the sight. Lynette Bird lifted her chin and regarded the audience coolly, head sharply tilted. When she parted her glittering lips and spoke, her voice was a sweep of warm light in the dim. Greenfinch and linnet bird, nightingale, blackbird.
How is it you sing?
An oft-repeated question. Why does the caged bird sing? Why does it not embrace silence and protest, refusing to give up the thing for which it was imprisoned? Why, day after day, does it warble and sway from perch to perch, trilling its essence out in unrepeatable sequence for the benefit of its captors? I am trusted! She laughed suddenly, a sound like glass bursting, with a muzzle, and enfranchised with a clog. Therefore I have decreed not to sing in my cage. With that, she closed her eyes and leaned her cheek against the feathers on her shoulder, looking for all the world like a bird asleep. Silence, then. Emily looked at Anna uncertainly, wondering if she should clap, but Anna was gazing at Lynette in rapt adoration. No one else seemed to think it was over, either. An uncomfortable minute passed, then two. A few people closed their eyes. A couple were staring intensely at their phones. One man nearby was moving his mouth without making a sound, and Emily realized he was counting. She looked back at the stage. Lynette remained completely immobile. The sound of the bartender wiping crumbs from the counter became noticeable. She heard people shifting a little in their seats, though none spoke. Emily frowned and looked down at her own phone. Had it been 4 minutes? 4 minutes of... Her eyes widened in sudden understanding.
Oh!
She clapped her hands over her mouth in a panic and looked at the stage, but Lynette hadn't moved. It was only every other head in the cafe that had swung towards her, some frowning, some biting down a laugh, some laughing outright. Anna stared at her in an astonishment that bordered on reproach. Cheeks flushing, Emily fixed her eyes on the floor and tried to will it into melting away and taking her with it. But only for another 30 seconds, as Lynette's performance of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds came to an end. As people began to clap, Emily raised her head again. Lynette had opened her eyes and was looking directly at her. She seemed amused. "The reason, ultimately," she said, stretching her neck from one side to the other and rolling back her feathered shoulders, "is that silence is terribly boring, no? Let us jubilate." With that, Lynette launched into the most unearthly rendition of Sondheim's Green Finch and Linnet Bird Emily had ever heard. It was like sugar melting into caramel, hearing that bright, glittering song dimmed into a smoky minor key and twisted, stretched into so unlikely a shape. To listen was to feel her heart dragged over burrs, each turn of lyrics snagging and pulling at her. By the time Lynette was asking the birds to teach her to be more adaptive, Emily had a pain in her throat and wet cheeks. Anna was quietly sobbing next to her. Emily stretched out her hand without a word. Anna took it and squeezed.